Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Call of Literature conference. We're delighted to welcome you here this afternoon, and I'm now going to pass you to Francesca. Francesca, over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody, or at least all those of you who are on this side of the pond, and good morning to all of those of you who are on the other side. I'm Francesca Bugliani, and I'm delighted to introduce the sixth Power of the Word conference, How Time Flies. Our first conference took place in London at Heathrow College in the summer of 2011. And since then, we have held more or less a conference every other year, in London again, then in Gdansk, in Rome, and in Oxford. We, that is this year's conference organizers, namely Michael Keown, Martina Jelinkova, David Lonsdale, and myself, together with our Dublin colleagues, had originally planned this conference to be held at the Institute of Trinity College, Dublin, at the Loyola Institute at Trinity College, Dublin. But as you all know, coronavirus did not oblige. Rather than postpone for yet another year, we thought we would try our hand at a Zoom conference. Fortunately, you don't have to be left at the mercy of my technological skills. We had the great fortune to ask the virtual conference facilitators, named the Collective, to mastermind the proceedings. The Flannery O'Connor Charitable Trust and the Irish Jesuits kindly made this possible through their generous financial donation. Although we cannot all be in flesh together in Dublin on this occasion, we thought we could transport you there in spirit. The very first item on the conference agenda is the welcome from Trinity College, Dublin. Michael Keown, together with Anne-Marie Diffley, will be introducing us to some of the great treasures held in the Trinity Library, including the most precious and famous item, the Book of Kells, Power of the Word indeed. I thought it might be a good idea also to say just a few words, particularly for those of you who have not participated in previous conferences, about the power of the word. The original and enduring idea of the project was to facilitate conversations between theologians, philosophers, literary scholars, and creative writers, freed of the constraint of geographical and scholarly boundaries. The project's title, Power of the Word, as you may have guessed, is intended to echo Karl Rahner's theological concept of the written word, particularly poetry, as a preambulum fidei. The conferences have produced 6 volumes, all well received, and this conference will, fingers crossed, be no less successful. We have a series of panels, which are very rich, that explore the call of literature as understood by poets, by critics, by theologians and philosophers, not to mention 6 keynote addresses. On top of that, we have 3 poetry readings. So we have something for everyone. And without further ado, then we can move to Trinity College to start the conference off. And immediately after that, we can move on to our first major theme, which is the call of poetry, connecting today's parallel sessions, the 2 keynote lectures, and the poetry reading. To you, Michael.
Good afternoon. A very warm welcome to Dublin. As Francesca has indicated, it's very unfortunate that we cannot gather in person for this 6th Power of the Word conference. But I hope it will be possible to welcome you on some occasion in the future. The power of the word reverberates in this city, in Dublin's literary museums and galleries, in its festivals, and in the streets, shops, and yes, the pubs, immortalised by James Joyce, Patrick Kavanagh, William Butler Yeats, and many others. I speak to you today from one such location, the Henry Jones Room of the Old Library at Trinity College, Dublin. I'm the director of the Loyola Institute, an institute of theology within the Catholic tradition. And our concern at Loyola and within the School of Religion here at Trinity is to explore the many different ways in which men and women, past and present, have experienced the insistent call of the sacred and how they've responded by acts and lives of self-transcendence. A conversation, therefore, between theology, philosophy, and literary art. A conversation which is as old as Plato, and yet is as vibrant and important as ever. This ancient conversation continues today with this conference on the call of literature. We begin by focusing upon a wonderful artifice of eternity, the Word of God, which is also a miraculously fashioned work of literary art. My colleague Anne-Marie Diffley has been introducing visitors to the Book of Kells for over 20 years, and I hand over to her now.
Anne-Marie, we can't hear your audio. So we're just having a few technical problems with our connection to Dublin. We're just trying to get them back online now. I'll just try phoning Michael.
He said, I've always imagined that paradise would be a place called library. I'm walking in the footsteps of these literary heroes through the magnificent 18th century library, filled with 200 thousands of the library holders' books, which is basically shortened. You can imagine what he said in spring. Together with my colleagues from the Loyola Institute, I want to see a very successful conference. I do hope that we will be able to.
Welcome to the Old Library at Trinity College, Dublin. Tucked away in this magnificent building is a copy of the Four Gospels, the Book of Kells, a 9th century manuscript that is famed for its artwork. I'm going to take you on a journey from 9th century Ireland, the time of the Book of Kells, right up to the 18th century and our beautiful library, the Long Room. Before we begin, let's look at the Book of Kells in more detail. What exactly is the Book of Kells? It is a lavishly decorated manuscript of the Four Gospels of the Christian New Testament. Here are the symbols: Matthew the man, Mark the lion, Luke the calf, and John the eagle. And these symbols were used in medieval manuscripts. We believe that the Book of Kells was written on the island of Iona in the monastery that had been founded by St. Columkill at least 2 centuries previously. The book, we think, dates from around the year 800, which was also the time of the Viking invasions to Britain and Ireland. The island of Iona had been attacked many times. After a particularly bad raid in 806, the monks decided to leave, came to Ireland, and they settled at their sister monastery in Kells, County Meath. And that is why we call it the Book of Kells, after its last resting place. It stayed in Kells until the middle of the 17th century, and because of the upheaval in the country, the book was brought to Dublin for safekeeping. In 1661, the Book of Kells, along with the Book of Durrow, was brought to Dublin for safekeeping and given to Trinity College, where it's remained ever since. Visitors have been coming to see the Book of Kells since the middle of the 19th century, including Queen Victoria, who on her visit to Ireland came to Trinity twice. What is the Book of Kells made of? It's made of vellum, which is calf skin. It took the skins of 185 calves to make the 680 pages in the Book of Kells. At this period, calf skin, goat skin, and sheepskin was commonly used, with calf skin being the most favorable one to use. We don't know who wrote the Book of Kells. Experts believe that they were young men between the ages of 14 and 16. Latin would not have been their first language, it would have been Irish. So there are mistakes in the Book of Kells, including one page that has been copied twice. You'll note this page by the red crucifixes around the edge, which we believe is the medieval term for please delete this page. The Book of Kells is rightly famed for its ornamentation and colours. Even 1200 years on, we can see how vibrant the colours are in the Book of Kells. The belief was that, in fact, the colours came from all over the world. But work done in the conservation department, we now know that the colour palette was, in fact, more limited. But these young monks were talented. They mixed colours, they layered colours. Some of the colours that they used, for instance, this blue colour, woad, comes from a flowering plant. The black colour here comes from soot from chimneys or lamps. It's also used for the script in the Book of Kells. The purple colour you see over here is a lichen, and this lovely, rich yellow colour is arsenic sulfide, which in fact is toxic. We hope these young monks weren't licking their paintbrushes. What makes the Book of Kells so special is the meticulous artwork. It's reminiscent of the high crosses and the jewellery of the time, often referred to as the work of angels, but as we know, it wasn't angels, but teenage boys that created the Book of Kells. There are 35 of what we call these highly decorated pages in the Book of Kells, full of swirls and circles and Celtic knots. But even on the text pages, apart from 2, there is colour. This makes the Book of Kells unique. There is no other medieval manuscript from this period that is so lavishly decorated. The Book of Kells was not for everyday use. It was a ceremonial book, an aid to faith, if you like, altar furniture. The artwork in the Book of Kells is of its time. In this image of St. John, you can see many influences. It looks a bit like a Russian icon. This would be the Byzantine influence. There's also influences from the Vikings, from Germany, and of course this interlacing is typical of Celtic art, originally pagan, now incorporated into Christian Celtic art. The book was sent for conservation work in the 19th century, and the bookbinder trimmed the pages in the Book of Kells. So from this image of St. John, you can clearly see hands and feet, but at the top of the page, what should be God's head has been chopped off. We're now going to view this 9th century manuscript up close and personal. The pages in the Book of Kells are turned frequently, so we usually have an illustrated page along with a text page on view. So come follow me into the treasury. This room was specially designed to maintain this ancient treasure. The current page on view in the treasury is the Virgin and Child. It is the only picture of a woman in the Book of Kells. You will see Jesus sitting on her lap. You can see that he's a redhead. In fact, you will see in other pictures of Jesus throughout the Book of Kells, he is depicted with red curly hair. This is reflecting the Scots, the Irish, and the odd Viking that were around at this period. The Virgin is surrounded by the archangels, Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel, and they are holding fans which are called flabella. These were used in the Eastern Church to keep the flies off the altar when the priest was celebrating Mass. Not needed in the Western Church, and they become symbols of purification. They are surrounded by a border that is interwoven with snakes, who are perceived as a symbol of Christ's resurrection, as the snake was reborn when it shed its skin. Snakes feature in most of the decorative pages in the Book of Kells, as do the Celtic designs you see with the interlacing circles and swirls. At the bottom right-hand side of the page, you see 6 men who are designed to point the reader to the next page. And now, welcome to the long room. This is our wow moment. I think it speaks for itself. This library was built between 1712 and 1732. It's 65 metres long, and it has 200,000 of the library's oldest books in these shelves. When the library opened in 1732, there was 25,000 books rattling around on the shelves here. We are known as a legal deposit library, so since 1801, any book published in Britain or Ireland were entitled to one free copy of that book. So these shelves filled very quickly, and by 1860, we had a problem. The weight of the books was pushing the building that way, and the plaster roof began to crack. The solution was to raise the roof, put this barrel vaulted ceiling in, and fill the galleries upstairs with these transverse bookcases. So it's a marriage of 18th and 19th century architecture, and I think it works. On this level, you have 15th to 18th century books, and upstairs you have the 19th century copyright books. This room is often referred to as Ireland's greatest interior. It's also referred to as a cathedral of books, and as a visitor said to me recently, a canyon of books. So, with over 200,000 of the library's oldest books in this room, you're probably wondering how they are arranged. You'll notice above some of the base there's gold lettering. This refers to donors. So some of the collections have been kept together. You'll also notice here, we have big books down at this level, and the further on you go up, the smaller they get. I guess if you're coming down that ladder, you want to come down with a small book. You'll also see gold lettering along the shelving. This is because the cataloguing system here in the old library is based on the Latin alphabet. Hence, you'll see there's no J along the bay. So you will notice the room is lined by marble busts. The first 6 were given to us in 1743, and they're the Greeks and the Romans. They then added other busts, for instance, Shakespeare, Locke, Newton, Boyle the chemist. The rest of the busts down the other end are of Trinity people, famous and not so famous. You'll also notice that none of the busts are of women, because women only came to Trinity College in 1904. Happily, this will change, because in the future we are planning to add some female busts to the long room. The long room is full of treasures, And here we are standing in front of one of the few surviving proclamations of the Irish Republic. About 1,000 of these posters were printed over the weekend of Easter 1916. Less than 50 survive, and we have 2 here in Trinity College. The document declares Ireland a republic, and it's a document before its time. It was supervised by James Connolly in Liberty Hall. They printed the first half, and then they had to reset the type and print the second half. So in fact, this document is full of typos. We're now in front of the Brian Boru harp, traditionally known as Ireland's oldest harp, dating from the 15th century. It's made of willow and oak, and as you can see, it's quite highly carved with lovely traditional Irish symbols. You'll also notice that there are some semi-precious stones or some that in fact are missing. Now, the feature of the Irish harp is that the strings are metal, in this case brass, but in medieval times often in gold and silver. The bards, the men who played these instruments, were held in high esteem because really they were the oral historians of the time, keeping alive the songs, the stories, the sagas of the various families. From very early times, the symbol of the harp has been used to represent or symbolize Ireland in literature. In the 1920s, the new Irish government adopted the harp as the national emblem of Ireland. You see it on our coins, you see it on government publications, and of course, you see it on that lovely beverage on bottles of Arthur Guinness. Thank you for joining me on this tour through some of Ireland's greatest cultural treasures. I do hope it was an enjoyable one, and I'm only too delighted to answer any of your questions.
It's with great honour and delight that I introduce our opening speaker for this conference. If there is one name associated with the interdisciplinary study of theology and literature within the English-speaking academy, it is the name of David Jasper, Professor Emeritus of Literature and Theology at the University of Glasgow. David's involvement in shaping this conversation goes back to the 1980s, when he founded the Conference of Literature and Religion at the University of Durham. And he was one of the founding editors of the Journal of Literature and Theology in 1987. His many publications over the last 30 years include introductions, handbooks, and readers, as well as studies of Coleridge, Romanticism, scriptural canon, monastic theology, and liturgy. In recent years, he has combined his academic work with parish priestly ministry in the west of Scotland. His 2016 book, Literature and Theology as a Grammar of Assent, directs us to the theme he will be addressing today: John Henry Newman, Poetry and the Grammar of Assent. There is, quite simply, no one better suited to open this Power of the Word conference. David Jasper, you are very welcome.
Thank you very much indeed for that very warm welcome, and I hope I can live up to it in what I'm about to say. In January 1829, when John Henry Newman was 27, he published in the London Review an essay entitled Poetry with reference to Aristotle's Poetics. Here Newman makes a specific connection between, quote, the want of the religious principle and want of poetical feeling. And he asserted that revealed religion should be especially poetical, and that a poetical view of things was a duty for every Christian. Throughout his life, Newman maintained this intrinsic relationship between poetry and religion, culminating in perhaps his greatest work, an essay in aid of a grammar of assent of 1870. Newman's assessment of the roots of the Oxford movement is clearly articulated early in his Apologia Pro Vita Sua of 1864. After the influence of Sir Walter Scott, most significantly, he writes of the poet and thinker Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Here's his words. While history in prose and verse were thus made the instrument of church feelings and opinions, a philosophical basis for the same was laid in England by a very original thinker, who, while he indulged a liberty of speculation which no Christian can tolerate, and advocated conclusions that were often heathen rather than Christian, yet after all installed a higher philosophy into inquiring minds than they had hitherto been accustomed to accept. Coleridge, in short, suggests Newman, made us think, and to think through the medium of poetry and imagination. Arguably, the two works which most pervade the complex pages of the Grammar of Assent are Bishop Butler's Analogy of Religion and Coleridge's Aids to Reflection of 1825. But let me turn for a moment to Germany, where the 19th century saw the professionalization of serious academic study. When Baron Wilhelm von Humboldt opened his new University of Berlin in 1810, the Faculty of Theology was separate from the Faculty of Arts, between the two being what Hermann Usner was in 1888 to call a Gletscherwall, a glacial moraine. Academic disciplines were to be kept separate, and above all, theology was set apart in splendid isolation from the rest of the humanities. But Newman, in his idea of what a university ought to be, was equally clear about the organic interconnectedness of all fields of study, including theology and religion, affirming that all knowledge forms one whole because its subject matter is one. For the universe in its length and breadth is so intimately knit together that we cannot separate off portion from portion. It all coheres. Throughout his life, Newman pondered upon the question of epistemology. How do we know? And above all, how do we come to assent to a truth, and especially the truth of Christianity? The Grammar of Assent carefully distinguishes between real and notional assent, between assent and inference, examines the role of conscience in our knowledge of God, and perhaps above all describes the nature of what Newman calls the illative sense, by which, in the process of attaining religious certitude and assent, facts are judged by processes that are beyond the strict limits of strict logic and reason. Although in extreme and forgetful old age, Newman professed to know nothing of the work of Coleridge, it is very clear that he was from an early stage in his career deeply influenced by the poet. He follows Coleridge in an understanding of the living power of language, what John Coulson many years ago called the fiduciary use of language. Coulson describes this in this way, drawing on the terms of Grammar of Assent. The primary response to language is not analytic, but fiduciary. In religion, as in poetry, we are required to make a complex act of inference and assent, and we begin by taking on trust expressions which are usually an analogical, metaphorical, or symbolic form, and by acting out the claims they make. Understanding religious language is a function of understanding poetic language. The words of John Coulson. For Coleridge, the power of the word was living and unifying. In a magnificent passage in the Statesman's Manual of 1815, Coleridge describes words as the wheels of Ezekiel's chariot, the living chariot that bears up for us the throne of the divine humanity. Words are, says Coleridge, the living educts of the imagination, unifying all things and one with the truth of which they are the expression. For both Coleridge and Wordsworth, the imagination is the key to human knowing, our means of perception of divinity itself. In his preface to the Lyrical Ballads of 1800, Wordsworth suggests that the imagination is given, quote, to incite and support the eternal. And of course, Coleridge's key definition of the primary imagination is to be found in chapter 13 of the Biographia Literaria of 1817, the living power and prime agent of all human perception, a representative in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Now, the importance of the imagination was not, of course, original to Coleridge. Mary Warnock begins her book, Imagination, of 1976, with Hume's Treatise of Human Nature of 1740, while admitting that Descartes at least should be given priority to this. For Coleridge, perhaps the most important influence on his thinking about the imagination was Kant, and the sense of the self, in Warnock's words, for whom the world is presented and by whom it is organized. And so for Newman, then, there is a clear sense of the rich philosophical and poetical tradition in which he is writing. But in one way, he would clearly distinguish himself from Coleridge, whom, as we've heard, he called conclusions that were often heathen rather than Christian. And Newman asserts in the Apologia that Coleridge failed to make a proper distinction between the religious and the poetic. For Newman, these two require each other, though they're not to be confused. And so, turning now to Newman's writings, and in the first instance to his magnificent university sermons delivered in Oxford between 1826 and 1843. And we see that his early preaching is already anticipating the grammar of assent. Everywhere in the sermons is felt the presence of Aristotle and the Nicomachean ethics, which are at the heart also of his later description of the illative sense, as it is guided by phronesis or judgment. Following Bishop Joseph Butler, Newman is careful to assert that proper judgment extends beyond the limits of human reason or logic and is rooted, in Butler's words, in the particular constitution of our actual human nature. So there's nothing abstract here, but rather an empiricist insistence on the actual and the individual. And in both the sermons and the grammar of assent, Newman makes clear his dislike of Archdeacon Paley, whom he regards as a Philistine, in his postulates governed only by the abstract rules of mathematics and reason. Newman, on the other hand, takes his beginning in the power of the Word made flesh, in the event of the incarnation, which, as Newman puts it in the Grammar of Assent, reconciles conflicting and divergent descriptions. It is within the liberality of the illative sense that Christian doctrine and belief demand assent. And here's a key passage in the Grammar of Assent. Newman writes, "I think then that the circumstances under which a professed revelation comes to us may be such as to impress both our reason and our imagination with a sense of its truth. That is, of coincidences which are indications to the illative sense of those who believe in a moral governor, of his immediate presence, especially to those who in addition hold with me the strong antecedent probability that in his mercy he will thus supernaturally present himself to our apprehension. So the illative sense then entertains what science cannot determine, says Newman, which is the limit of converging probabilities and the reasons sufficient for a proof. In short, the illative sense is that by which, on the balance of probabilities, we are led to the point of assent, as opposed to inference, which is led purely by reason. Behind this, the shadow of Coleridge is clear. For in the poetic mind, the imagination has two functions: to shape by means of an inner power, and to make one that which is otherwise diverse. And secondly, to enable us to feel. For Coleridge, in Aids to Reflection, Christianity is not a theory or a speculation, but a life, not a philosophy of life, but a life and a living process. And he famously adds, evidences of Christianity, I am weary of the word. Make a man feel the want of it. Now, Christianity as this felt living process that binds all together, acknowledged in the illative sense that enables that imaginative assent that leads to belief, is the central theme of the Grammar of Assent. Looking back in the book to his 1841 pamphlet, The Tamworth Reading Room, in which Newman had dismissed the project in which, quote, the instrumentality of mechanics institutes and reading rooms could lead workers to religion. Here he repeatedly affirms that it is only by an imaginative or real assent that the mind arrives at the doctrine that there is one God. His concern is not with so much theology, though finally, without theology, religion cannot stand. Theology, that is, which deals with notional apprehension, but with religion itself, which is concerned with imaginative apprehension. Now, Newman's appeal throughout this book is repeatedly to literary illustrations of his theme, and he encourages us in the reading of fiction. It should be recalled, of course, that Newman himself was not only a poet, but published two novels, Loss and Gain in 1848 and Callista in 1855. And I'll come briefly at the end back to Callista before I finish. For example, Newman refers to Mrs. Elizabeth Gaskell's account of the death of the factory girl Bessie Higgins in her 1854 novel North and South. And he uses this as what he calls an argument for the immortality of the soul. He quotes the words of Bessie as she dies, her lungs choked with the dust and fluff of the factory. I think if this life is the end, and that there is no God to wipe away all tears from all eyes, I could go mad, says Bessie. The illative sense is not an intellectual faculty, and no scientific common measure is required to realize belief in the soul of this poor and uneducated factory girl. Or later, he refers to Anthony Trollope's novel of 1862, Orley Farm, in which the lawyer, Mr. Chaffanbrass, perceives the natural dignity and goodness of the central character, Lady Mason, even though he intuits that she is technically guilty of deception and crime. And Newman gives this as an example of what he calls the intuitive perception of character possessed by certain people. Now, such is the illative faculty found in both true poetry and religious assent. First described in the early essay, Poetry with reference to Aristotle's Poetics, and expanded in Newman's 1858 lecture entitled Literature. In the Grammar of Assent, Newman sums up with Wordsworthian overtones how natural inference may lead to assent. He writes, "As true poetry is a spontaneous outpouring of thought, and therefore belongs to rude as well as to gifted minds, whereas no one becomes a poet merely by the canons of criticism, so this unscientific reasoning, being sometimes a natural, uncultivated faculty, sometimes approaching to a gift, sometimes an acquired habit and second nature, has a higher source than logical rule, nascitur non fit." In the Excursion in 1814, Wordsworth had written, "Oh, many are the poets that are sown by nature, men endowed with highest gifts, the vision and faculty divine." It's pure Newman. Towards the end of the Grammar of Assent, Newman returns to the world of his novel Callista in an extended, imaginative account of the experience of early Christian martyrdom. He begins with the vivifying idea of Christ, finding it first among the poor and uneducated of early Christianity, and what Wordsworth in his 1800 preface to the Lyrical Ballads called the essential passions of the human heart. Newman writes, first, that this thought or image of Christ was the principle of conversion and of fellowship, and next, that among the lower classes who had no power, influence, reputation, or education, lay its principal success. Newman spares few details in his dramatic and harrowing descriptions of the deaths of the early martyrs, before turning to the theology of the apologists from Justin Martyr and Tertullian to Origen. And he sums up the power of Christianity in the penultimate paragraph of his book. Such minds it addresses both through the intellect and through the imagination, creating a certitude of its truth by arguments too various for direct enumeration, too personal and deep for words, too powerful and concurrent for refutation. Nor need reason come first and faith second, though this is the logical order. But one and the same teaching is in different aspects both object and proof, and elicits one complex act both of inference and of assent. It speaks to us one by one as the counterpart, so to say, of ourselves, and is real as we are real. At the heart of poetry and at the heart of religion is what both Coleridge and Newman call an idea that is open to the imagination and sustainable by reason. Ideas are conveyed through the living power of words that are not finally to be separated from that which they express. As Coleridge once put it in a letter to William Godwin, "I would endeavor to destroy the old antithesis of words and things, elevating, as it were, words into things and living things too." Both Coleridge and Newman pursue an idealist epistemology, for, says Coleridge, a hunger-bitten and idea-less philosophy naturally produces a starveling and comfortless religion. Coleridge and Newman also share a precise and often complex literary style, though Newman is the more polished. Newman is also clear that in the end, there is a clear distinction to be made between literature and religion in the matter of assent, though at the same time, they cannot finally be separated. His use of literary examples in the Grammar of Assent suggests that Coleridge's familiar description of poetic faith as the willing suspension of disbelief is not far from Newman's position too. For the path to assent begins with an act of the will, a decision to suspend disbelief and a readiness to believe. It is then a question of following the path through inference to assent by the accumulation of probabilities. But there is the difference between poetry and religion. For in any reading of North or South or Orley Farm, we know that this is merely a fictive world created by Elizabeth Gaskell or Anthony Trollope. And Newman, far more than Coleridge, acknowledges the difference between the categories of the literary and the religious. Romantic poetry after Coleridge tended on the whole to move away from Christianity, as for example in Shelley's 1821 Defence of Poetry, which sees only the poetry in the doctrines of Jesus Christ, except, that is, in the forms of romanticism taken up by the Oxford movement. In his lectures and writings on the idea and nature of a university, Newman makes it clear that as religion and religious belief needs theology as a branch of knowledge, so also it needs the imaginative and intuitive power of words in poetry and literature, though without the two being confused. In the exercise of reason and the insights of the imagination, that shaping spirit that holds all things together, all forms of human inquiry and creativity combine and find for Newman their fulfillment in the truths of revealed religion as assented to by the illative faculty. In brief, Newman does not acknowledge the new disciplined academic world of the University of Berlin. And so in conclusion, when I set out some years ago, as has been mentioned already this afternoon, to write a history of the conferences on literature and religion that we began in the early 1980s in Durham, I entitled the book Literature and Theology as a Grammar of Assent, modeling my sense of what we were trying to achieve on Newman's great work. But there is a holistic and organic quality in Newman's epistemological grammar, a visionary generosity that combines reason and faith, a hospitality to truth that somehow we failed to find anew. Perhaps all of us are too far gone as the children of Baron Wilhelm von Humboldt's vision of a university divided into disciplinary departments. Stanley Fish once made clear for us the impossibility of the interdisciplinary project, but his words made little impression. I suppose in the end, what we lacked was not only the brilliance, but the courage of Newman to find in the power of words, in fiduciary language, the forms of expression that might embrace and find for us the mystery of revealed religion. An essay in a grade of a grammar of assent is not an easy book to read. An early review notice in the tablet expressed regret that the philosophical basis of Newman's thought was not more in accordance with the general teaching of Catholic philosophy. But Newman is strictly neither a theologian nor a philosopher, strictly speaking. Rather, in the Grammar of Assent, he draws all things together as a true romantic, finding in the power of words and their assemblage in grammatical forms that which Coleridge likened to the wheels of the chariot of Ezekiel's vision. As Coleridge wrote, whithersoever the spirit was to go, they went. Thither was their spirit to go, and the wheels were lifted up over against them, for the spirit of the living creature was in the wheels. A vision to be embraced, as Newman would have put it, by both intellect and imagination. thus in his words, creating a certitude of its truth by arguments too various for direct enumeration, too personal and deep for words, too powerful and concurrent for refutation. Thank you very much indeed.
David, thank you for a thoughtful and thought-provoking talk, a really wonderful way to start the conference. Rather than take questions now, we're going to open the floor for you to offer your thoughts and reflections. What is it that's intrigued you in what you've just heard from David? What connections or links did it trigger for you? What might you like to add to the dialogue? The open floor will be in the form of up to 1 minute inputs, so we will be timing you, but they are uninterrupted. The beauty of uninterrupted 1 minute inputs. And once we've heard from a few people, then I'll invite David to respond. If you'd like to contribute to the open floor session, then please do use your kind of Zoom raise hand function. So in the menu at the bottom of your screen, you should find a little sort of, I think it's a smiley face button that says reactions. And if you click on that, within that, there's another button that says raise hand. So I think Liz and Scott are demonstrating. That will just bring you to my attention, and I'll be able to pass to you for your 1 minute input. We're really keen to hear from you. Equally, as you're listening to people who are making their contributions, you may want to add further thoughts and reflections into the chat box. One of the advantages of working online is that you can have those kind of two parallel conversations going on. So what someone's saying out loud and then the chance to respond to it in writing in chat. But who would like to start us off by adding something and sharing a thought or reflection following David's talk?
Currently, you're all muted as well, so please remember to unmute before you start to talk.
Okay, well, Francesca, perhaps you'd like to share some thoughts to what I'm sure will be opening the floodgates for other people to offer theirs. We'll just need to unmute Francesca.
Rather than offering a reflection, because so many connections came to mind, I wonder whether I could raise this question, which is not directly to David, but even to others. What did it mean to Newman to be a poet? Because he wrote poetry, and it's very, very interesting poetry. So how did that in a way enrich his faith, or was a product of his faith in his own experience? You know, how did poetry and faith combine?
Thank you, Francesca. Brilliant. So, Catherine, lovely to see your Zoom hand raised. Over to you then. If you'd like to unmute, the floor is yours.
Thank you to David for another fabulous lecture, in which he's managed to pack an awful lot, such that quite a few of us are sort of rather stupefied as to how to contribute. But one interesting thing I'd sort of put into the discussion, which is Newman is clearly working with the romantic understanding of literature and religion, as evidenced by sort of Coleridge and Wordsworth sort of echoing or originating these ideas. However, what seems to have happened with a lot of the romantic poets, people like Keats or Blake, for example, is that what they've decided to do with religion is ultimately throw out most of Christianity, because it's seen as being sort of stifling individual creativity and the imagination, and formulating their own faiths or imaginative traditions, which for someone like Blake seems to be consisting of, you know, free love, throwing out the church, throwing out the ministers, the priests, as I'm sure David well knows, that if Blake is a Christian, he's a very interesting Christian. And I wonder really, perhaps later on, if you might actually want to think about the connections Newman might have had with someone like Blake or even Keats. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you. Would anyone else like to build on what they've heard from Francesca or Catherine, Oh, yes. Jean, over to you. I can't see you, but hopefully, there we are. Lovely to see your face. You'll just need to unmute, Jean. Perfect.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to ask, I mean, really, there's no sort of hidden agenda to this question, but it just occurred to me, if Newman is not a theologian or a philosopher in a strict sense, I mean, what does it mean to be a theologian or a philosopher in a strict sense? Thank you. It's just a...
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you very much. So David, Jasper, I wonder if we could come to you now for your kind of response to what you've heard from Francesca, Catherine and Jean. I'm looking for David on my screen. There we are. You're on mute, I'm afraid, David. You just need to unmute.
My apologies, my apologies. Right. Thank you very much indeed. Well, first of all, what does it mean for Newman to be a poet? Well, I think at his best, actually, Newman wasn't a bad poet. I mean, he wasn't a great poet, but I mean, it seems to me that in all he writes and in his sermons, he is an extraordinary stylist. I mean, he writes beautiful poetic prose, and he's almost incapable of writing anything other than something that is kind of halfway to poetry, and I think it's actually inbred into the way he kind of thinks, really, that he thinks, as did Coleridge in his way, he thinks very profoundly with the power of words. And language itself is very important for him. So I mentioned at one point the importance for him of the incarnation, the Johannine word, which was absolutely central for Coleridge, the word made flesh. And I think in some respects that almost lies at the heart of Newman's writing and thinking, that it's the word, what he's actually working with, made flesh, the incarnation. And that, of course, is also his difference, or one of his differences from Coleridge, who doesn't say much actually about the incarnation at all, whereas for Newman, it was absolutely central to all his thinking. So I think Newman is a kind of natural poet in a certain kind of way, and rereading for this occasion The Grammar of Assent. I mean, it isn't an easy book, but you realize what an extraordinary writer and stylist and wordsmith he was as well. And that kind of takes me to Jean's question, or Jean's point as well, that he's not a philosopher and a theorist. I mean, that was kind of a slightly throwaway line, as you give in lectures. But I think there's a truth in that you know, if you think of the early Oxford fathers, I mean, there certainly were theologians. Wilberforce was clearly a very extraordinary theologian. Newman, in a sense, had a kind of almost impetuosity that takes him beyond that almost immediately. And although he's clearly a very learned man, particularly in his work on the early church fathers and so on and so forth, I don't think that actually theology, in the strict sense of the word, was his preoccupation. I think it was actually something else. And similarly, I don't think that philosophy was I don't think he had a philosophical mind, partly because he was, I think, a poet ultimately. Now, I'm not suggesting that those two are incompatible, but I think it's a cast of mind, which for him, the kind of arguments he uses, his profound sense of the illative sense, which is how he's working all the time, building up the balance of probabilities rather than building, as it were, reasoned arguments. So he's not operating like, as it were, a philosopher strictly does. And so finally, I think that takes me to Catherine's point. Well, heaven knows what he'd have made of Blake. I mean, I think, you know, there's a long way from Blake to Keats and Shelley. I think for him, the secret lies within, oddly enough, Coleridge's reading of Kant in the Biographia Literaria. Coleridge has a very peculiar reading of Kant. And like most of his readings, Coleridge reads somebody else and then kind of turns them into Coleridge, as it were, because he's really developing his own thoughts. And however odd Coleridge might be in many ways, finally, it seems to me, he cannot ever escape from that notion, that constitutive notion, that ontologically rooted notion of God. Which for Kant ultimately is regulative, not constitutive. And so however Coleridge can follow thinking down odd avenues, ultimately, you see this in the posthumously published Confessions of an Inquiring Spirit, he is a deeply religious soul who is exploring this passionate want for Christian, make him feel the want of it, he says. So I think that, you know, deep down in a curious way, Coleridge and Newman were kind of one, and Newman recognizes this in the Apologia, that although Coleridge is so different in so many ways, actually deep down, Coleridge and Newman have a commonality, which lies in this ineradicable sense, I think, of the reality of the divine. It's a real thing, and that is found primarily through the power of words. Now, you know, they don't have that kind of egotistical quality that is found in so much other romantic poetry, from Keats to Shelley, particularly. Blake is a different category altogether. Actually, Coleridge says some quite positive things about Blake, but of course he's perhaps in a different category, but also I think a deeply, profoundly religious person in the deepest sense of the word. So I think it's that Coleridge and Newman have this kind of sense together of the power of words, which for them, as it were, in that great vision of Ezekiel's chariot, you know, that it's the word that carries you ultimately to the reality of the divine. And that really disintegrates in the kind of egotistical drift, as it were, anthropocentric drift of some of the other romantics.
David, again, thank you. And thank you to Catherine, Jean and Francesca for your contributions. And I think some of the themes that have been discussed, I'm sure that they will continue to run as threads throughout the course of the rest of the discussions today. What we'd like to do now is move into the parallel sessions. So were we all face to face, as we'd hoped to have been in Dublin, then this would be the point when you'd be kind of picking up your bags and heading off down a corridor, desperately looking for whichever room you were hoping to be in. Part of the joys of working online is that you don't need to do that room reallocation. We can stay here. How instead we are going to do it is by moving into breakout groups, and you are going to choose which breakout group you would like to join and which speakers you would therefore like to hear. Over the course of the next hour, there'll be 3 speakers within each room, each sort of speaking around a theme. So Scott, I think we have a slide with those themes on, please. Thank you. So in breakout room 1, our speakers are going to be exploring the poetic and the, oh, that's come up right in front of my thing, the poetic and the religious calling. Then in breakout room 2, discerning the vocation of literature, the poets speak. And in breakout room 3, poetry and didacticism. So you can see now that Scott has opened the breakout rooms. So you should be able to see that pop up, or if you press on the breakout room button in your menu, if you scroll down the box that pops up, you'll be able to see rooms 1, 2, and 3, and you can choose which one to join. The speakers should move there automatically. They should already be there. If for you this just doesn't work, sometimes the breakout room button just doesn't behave itself, then please don't worry. If you pop into chat which room you'd like to join, then we can allocate you manually. It will just take us a few minutes, but we will get you there and make sure you're in the room that you want to be. The frantic rearrangement of rectangles on my screen tells me that you are all coming back from the breakout rooms. It's good to see your faces. I hope we didn't cut too many of you off mid-sentence. And I also hope that that's been a very enjoyable and stimulating hour. It's certainly, I'm sure it's gone quickly. In a moment, we're going to take a short coffee break. And when we come back, there's going to be the opportunity to meet some of the other people here today in some kind of informal networking, informal conversations. And then we will be hearing from our second keynote speaker. But first of all, a chance to stretch your legs, perhaps grab a drink, take a little break. If you'd like to be back online, we'll get going again at 20 minutes past the hour, so 16:20 UK time, hopefully 20 minutes past the hour where you are. We will see you then.
Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. I'm not sure, wherever you are in the world, that's either giving you a chance to have morning coffee or it's giving you a chance to have a very late afternoon cup of tea. So welcome back. And we hope you have enjoyed the first session of this conference. And I'm sure by the way the first session's gone, we're in for a really entertaining and very thought-provoking week. We didn't and haven't had a chance to really talk to you a little bit about how we're going to work together over the next week. I think we had an incredible start and an incredible view of what might have been, which is us all in Dublin, and I'm sure we'd have all enjoyed some great Irish hospitality over coffee. And we're going to do our best to recreate as much as we can the experience for you that you would have had it been face to face, perhaps with some of the benefits of being able to sleep in your own bed at night, eat your own food, and perhaps also do a little bit of work in the morning. So there are advantages to the way we're going to work. As any conference is about networking and making connections, we do suggest that you try and keep your cameras on if your bandwidth will allow. This does make a massive difference, particularly to speakers, rather than looking out as I am now on lots of black boxes with white names. It's much, much nicer to look out onto real people. And I think that's something we've all missed over our interactions in the last year and a half. So if you could keep your cameras on, that would be great. And I know certainly the speakers would really, really welcome that. You've probably realised, and I think a lot of you know the score of muting during plenary sessions so we can avoid any background noise or any distractions. Something we would like you to do is check that your name or your Zoom handle, I think perhaps probably the right phrase, is what you wish it to be. Because as you've probably already seen, when we lead the plenary sessions, as Cara did, she will look for your name and we will call you, I'm afraid, whatever your Zoom name is. So if you wish everybody to know you and know who you are, then please put a fuller name. And we also quite understand if you're very happy with your name as it is. There is a live transcript available if you would like to avail yourself of that. That is in the bottom of your screen, and you should see a button called live transcript. If you press that, you will have the live transcript button. We've already demonstrated that chat is alive and very much alive, and we look forward to your thoughts and reflections during the plenary sessions, but we will turn it off when speakers are speaking because it can actually be quite distracting. And finally, I suppose this is a little bit of an advert. I know the Power of the Word team are very keen for you to have your say and also share thoughts, reflections, comments. And we've got two ways of doing that. At the end of every day, we will be having an open floor for you to share your reflections on the day. And we'll also be having those, as you've already experienced, after speakers. And we've also got a conference tabula. And this is a chance for you to actually write your feedback. And Scott, would you like to show us what's on the tabula?
Sure thing.
So this will be live and Cara will be putting the link into chat as we speak. So this is the conference tabula. You can take a post-it note. Scott, would you like to demonstrate?
Yep.
So you take a post-it note from the left-hand side of your screen. You put it in ideas or feedback or Atrium Day breakout room sessions, resources, connections, and ideas for the next conference. And you can just put your feedback. It can be anonymous, and you can also put your name to the feedback. But this will be live throughout the conference and after every day. So when we're not here, this is a very live board. So please put your feedback there. Now, there's one bit of this that I'd like to draw your attention to particularly, and that is the Atrium Day. If you've looked at your programme, you will have seen that on Wednesday, we have a very special day. This is a chance for you to do some informal networking in the same way that you would have done had we all been wandering around the glorious surroundings of Dublin. We can't promise you those glorious surroundings, but we can promise you an opportunity to maybe have a focused discussion. If you think there's a theme that's emerged on Monday and Tuesday, and you think, oh, actually, it would be great to have a discussion with people, just to share thoughts and views. It could be that you specifically want to meet a group of people. So you could put a post-it there saying, I'm very keen to meet Francesca, for example. And it could simply be that you are an emerging scholar and you would like to join other emerging scholars to have a conversation. So we're keen that this day is useful to you, but it also enables you to do the networking and making of connections that are so important for conferences. And we'd hate anybody to walk away from, on Friday and say, well, that was great. If only I'd had a chance to say, I would like to meet some people to further discuss Coleridge or Blake or the works of Cardinal Newman. So that's very, very important. So we will be looking at that certainly by the end of tomorrow, that's Tuesday, and we're hoping that there will be plenty of ideas on there for the Atrium Days. So the Atrium Day is essentially informal networking. It will be a series of breakout rooms and it will be running for about, is it 3 hours, Scott?
Yes.
3 hours in 20-minute slots. And we'll explain a little bit more about how that works, because that's a lot of information for day one. So as we've already said, we're really keen to have your say. You can do that during open floors, but you can also do that through the tabula. So we've been talking about informal networking and the glorious surroundings of Dublin. So I'd like, in your imagination, to take you there now. And we're going to be milling around a conference suite, no doubt in the beautiful surroundings of Trinity, perhaps with a lovely cup of tea and perhaps a lovely Irish cake in our, perhaps an Irish scone in our other hand. And we'd be bumping into people. And this is where serendipity happens. So we're now going to send you into breakout rooms through the power of Zoom. You should find yourself in a breakout room with 5 random delegates, and we're going to invite you to have a short conversation. We're then going to bring you back to the breakout rooms, and we're going to then send you for a second chance to have a conversation. So Scott, over to you. You had some, we trust that you did have some serendipitous moments and some good conversations in that short period of time. Everybody tells us that it's those serendipitous bumping into moments. They're the things that are increasingly missing in the world that we're now living in. So we will be doing informal networking at various times throughout the next 4 days. So please look out for that and please enjoy it. So I'm now delighted to pass to Jean Ward, and Jean will introduce our next keynote speaker. Jean, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. It's my really great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Marta Gibinska, who is one of Poland's and indeed Europe's most eminent Shakespeare scholars. She specializes in Renaissance and 17th century literature in English, especially Shakespearean drama and poetry. And she's taught at the Jagiellonian University, which is the oldest university in Poland with a very, very long tradition, and the Józef Tischner European University in Krakow, which is a much newer foundation. She is a member of the International Shakespeare Association and the European Shakespeare Association, And in 1992, she co-founded the Polish Shakespeare Society, of which she was president for very many years. The society was born out of a conference whose name I'll read in Polish, although it's very difficult to read in Polish and it will also be difficult to read in English. I'll explain why. The conference was called Od Shakespeare'a do Shakespeare'a. So it's from Shakespeare to Shakespeare, which is the Polish way of saying Shakespeare. That title actually, I think, provides an indication of one of Professor Gibinska's really great interests, which is the way in which Shakespeare becomes Shakespeare. In other words, the reception of Shakespeare in Poland, including the way that Polish poets read Shakespeare. The title of one of Professor Gibinska's monographs, Polish Poets Read Shakespeare, Refashioning of the Tradition, that's a book from 1999, but I think it indicates an interest that continues. And one very essential aspect of reception is translation. Professor Gibinska is also very much preoccupied, both as a scholar and as a teacher, with questions of translation. And that's not only of Shakespeare into Polish, but also of Polish poets into English. Professor Gibinska is no stranger to the Power of the Word project. As you will see, if you happen to open one of those books which was recently presented to us and advertised, that is the project's third publication, Poetic Revelations, which was the outcome of the third conference, which actually was held in Poland in Gdańsk in 2013. The title of Professor Gibinska's chapter, it's Word Made Flesh, Made Word, on the Poetic Force of Macbeth. And that, I think, shows clearly her concern with the text of Shakespeare, with his language as poetry, in the plays as much as in the sonnets. So poetry of all kinds, in Polish and in English, and not only of the Elizabethan and Jacobean period. This is what I think lies very close to Professor Gibinska's heart. So I think that the title of her presentation today, The Call of Poetry, is very much at the center of her interests. So thank you very much looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Jean, for this very, very generous introduction. I shall try now to very quickly share my screen with you. Here we go. There we are. I hope everybody can see it. All right. I just would like to start by saying thank you for the invitation to this conference. I feel very honored to be able to speak to all of you. And I apologize for the paper in advance. 20 minutes is very short time for what one would like to say. In the long course of literary history, in the European tradition in which I was educated, a work of literature had a firm objective status of a meaningful whole. The reader, therefore, was expected to answer to its call by reading and finding the core, the encoded message. That finding would be by and large dictated by the current aesthetic and ethical expectations. Therefore, we have to treat it as time-related. Still, the idea was always the same. Out there was a poem which contained its own special truth, and the game was to find it. The position of the literary work in respect of the reader was hierarchical. The authority was located in the text, which contained the author's unique statement. Wordsworth and Frost's definitions of poetry attest to that particular understanding of the call of poetry. The Romantic vision makes poetry the source of ultimate knowledge, which invites the reader to take up the study. Frost's less metaphysical and more rational definition invites the reader to the pleasures of discovering the key to the perfect stasis of emotion, thought, word combination of the text. Our times have brought a new paradigm, in which the call of literature is understood in a different way, because the status of the text as well as the relation of the text to the reader have been redefined. In these black lines on paper or on screen, no objective and definite truth is expected to be found anymore. I have to put the next screen. Great. Shakespeare's repeated hope that his poetry will, against all time, keep love alive is, not surprisingly, located in the reader's eyes. Only the act of reading is able to make sense of the Faustian combination of emotion, thought, word. It is the reader who creates the sense. Like Shakespeare, Emily Dickinson had a premonition of the reader's might. Shakespeare's belief in the timeless urge of human beings to read poetry, and Dickinson's intimate enunciation of her visceral recognition of true poetic art do not really conform to our postmodernist and post-structuralist understanding of the act of reading. Nevertheless, the two statements reveal the essential need of the reader for the literary text to make the call. And, not less important, of the artist's craving to be able to offer the reader an occasion for the dizziness of the experience of reading, of answering the call. In the postmodernist paradigm, the texts are opaque, and this opacity calls for renewed attempts at reading and interpreting. The text demands forever new answers to its call, and from this follows that we may answer Emily Dickinson's question. Yes, there are many other ways in which we react to art. And so we must accept the notion of difference, which offers us a number of heterogeneous features that govern the production of textual meaning. The endless chain of signifiers, as well as oppositions and hierarchies that differentiate the terms and underpin their meanings, subvert the possibility of establishing the finite interpretation. Our answer to the call of a literary text from the Derridian vantage would be to play, sometimes consciously, sometimes not, with the deferral and difference inscribed in language and intertextuality, which embraces not only other texts, which may appear more or less distinctly through the text fissures to the reader, but also the social, ideological, or economic texts in which the reader is immersed. In the end, our understanding of the call of literature must be complicated into the recognition of the mutual need of the text and the reader. Now, I would like to take a look at a more complicated pattern in which the bonds of the author, the text, and the reader may be considered. And first, I would like to consider what call hear the poets. Why do they write? As may be expected, there are as many answers as there are poets. Nevertheless, in what the poets articulate, we hear, just as they do, the call of poesy. Yes. From all these diverse enunciations that you may read on the screen, we may conclude, and these are all poets, that poetry calls to poets by its form, which makes them think twice about what they want to say and how to say it best. A charade, a puzzle, wait for solving. The call of poetry is definitely a challenge of form, of rhythm, and of tune, This means, in fact, the challenge of finding the right voice and the challenge of language, that fearful medium which one acquires from the very first day of life, which becomes part of the self, and which is surprisingly at odds with one's emotions, imagination, and thought. So to write would mean to struggle. But the call of poetry also means the urge and the need to express oneself, to enclose in the words one's own vision, experience, and perhaps what is particularly striking, the urge to get to the core even though the task is impossible. The seriousness and depth of the task puts poetry on the par with philosophical endeavors and religious intuitions. Julian Tuwim, the last poet on the screen, with his unique sense of humor, has put it in a striking phrase. Poetry, dear sirs, is a leap of a barbarian who has sensed God. Now, the poets are more than aware that what called them to write may not call to the reader. Readers bring their own reasons for opening a volume of poetry or taking a moment to pause and read a single poem in a column of the newspaper. The poet's words, the answer to the need to find the right expression to their own ideas, may call to the reader because they fit the reader's emotional moment, religious needs, aesthetic expectations, intellectual preoccupation, or simply sheer pleasure of language. We read poetry because, like poets, we hope to find the perfect expression of what we are looking for or asking for, the perfect verbal expression of what we feel, of what we are, or what we simply need to be. If poets answering the call of poetry feel exhilaration in the very act of writing, the readers feel exhilaration in the very act of reading. As readers, we constantly answer the various ways in which poetry calls, or to be more precise, we listen for that call which we want and need to answer in an instant. I can only offer the proof in the most subjective way, from my own response to the call of poetry. There are no rules, no guidelines which might ensure a universal truth. However, the response to poetry is something that we very often need to share, not necessarily expecting an identical reaction, but feeling that we approach in this way some level of universality. So what I want to share here with you are a few poems and a few reasons why these poems have become important for me. I want to begin with Psalms, the depth. The depth is a word of a particular force in this psalm, which gives me pause, makes me think and feel at the same time. What depth? Am I physically, topographically in plight? If so, I would, in case of danger, call out for help, try to turn to somebody. I would try to fight for life. The simplicity and obviousness of such situation lends force to the spiritual depth with which I respond to the prayer uttered so long ago and which was not mine, but becomes mine. For it makes me turn into myself and explore the depths of my misery. And it leads me to the only one who can help me, on whom I may and do hang my hope. This prayer is an expression of sinking in unhappiness, but also the expression of trust and belief that one will not perish. I trust God will be attentive to my voice, and I believe in his mercy. Otherwise, who shall stand? Where shall I stand? The breathtaking obviousness of this question turns into an interjection of total entrustment and dedication with which those simple verses call to me to follow, and I do whenever I need to be spiritually lifted. In Psalm 23, sounds in my ears whenever I am actually very happy. The force of these lines calls to my ability to appreciate the beauty of the earth, my habitat, and recognize in that beauty my own spiritual comfort. It offers to me an experience of an almost Platonic equation of beauty with goodness, an elevated emotional moment of being safe and well looked after because I live in this beautiful world created by God, and with which I am in a harmonious union. Therefore, I shall not want. Thou art with me. These two psalms express me best in the moments of misery and happiness. We all experience such moments. Perhaps not everybody turns to the Psalms, but if we do, the words have power to give us recognition of the sense and value of life. For believers, these words have an empowering might. They direct the barbarian's leap towards God. To return to Tuvim's aphorism again, the barbarian's leap is a daring enterprise into probing into truth. Many of the earlier quoted definitions of poetry that were on the screen stress the importance of vision and of the unattainable but ever attractive and teasing mystery of the multi-layered and endlessly inaccessible mystery of being in the world. The probing attempts may seem to slide down the visible and the tactile, but in reality, they are in traffic with the spiritual, with the moral, and with the aesthetic. Something like this is demonstrated by Jane Hirschfield in her reading of Gerald Manley Hopkins's The Windhover in one of her essays. Hirschfield says, I quote, "Poetry itself, when allowed to, becomes within us a playable organ of perception, sounding out its own forms of knowledge and forms of discovery. The words, the sounds, the rhythms lead us to things undiscoverable by other means." And indeed, I do not observe a falcon gliding in the air. I discover the riding and rolling and striding of complete freedom and complete control. More, the ecstasy of sweeping and gliding becomes my joy in the experience which the lines of the poem make me feel in my body and mind. The rolling r and sprung rhythm of repeated d and smoothness of w lift me as I read on. The verses and syntax make me whirl around in circles, discovering new vistas from above. Hopkins's vision calls on me to fly, to experience, to feel, to internalize, whatever I choose to take dapple dawn-drawn falcon to be. It becomes me and mine. The poem, for me, is an epiphany. For Hopkins and many readers, myself including, a religious epiphany. But it is not a prayer like the Psalms. So it opens to many other ecstatic readings, which all will depend on the reader's answer to the call of Hopkins's art. Alice Oswald, in her astounding reading of the Iliad, turns it into a poem and thus answers the call of Homer's, and excavates from his epos what struck her strongest, the need to translate the atmosphere, not the story, to use her own words, to retrieve the poem's energia. The amalgam of the heroic and the lyric is what strikes me most here. Consider the first 4 verses, read them aloud, and soon you will hear the epic narrator's voice, the chronicler, the historian, and yet more, it is not difficult to trace that voice to Beowulf and its Anglo-Saxon rhythms and its narrative foreshortening of action. And then suddenly, the blow right into your heart, the unexpected demonstration of the pain of death. Oswald moves completely out of the scene. She ensures that the voice of the poem is detached and distanced. After all, only an object is demonstrated, a hole in the helmet, a military factual witness. The more vibrant are therefore the words about the blade letting the darkness leak over his eyes. In a similar vein, the heroic Elephanor, who tried to take the body of his friend away from the battlefield, was stabbed in the only unguarded piece of his flesh. The seemingly objective relation is unbalanced with a seemingly disjoint information. He wore his hair long at the back. The obviously lyrical moment that follows is a completion of the empathy towards the single human being, of the emotional response to death and to the atrocity of the heroic tune. Oswald's ability to move me towards those soldiers, forgotten, of whom we know nothing, for what does a perfect fighter tell us about the man, is the call here. She pierces the heroic in order to open up a crack in its armor and make us feel the unique, unrepeatable human being whose life has been wasted. The last poem which I want to share with you is Ted Hughes' March Morning. A change of focus, which is not a change of focus. Short sentences, firmly divided by full stops. Lazy, contented, happy observation of light, movement, stillness, eye browsing the landscape, an intensive moment of feeling the spring. No speaker, the phrases call to us to live them. They reverberate in the consciousness of one who has lived such moments. And the second stanza, an entirely different landscape. Personification of earth, a wounded, exhausted human being exposing herself to the healing warmth of the sun and the coda, which lets us make connection between a personal, momentary experience of the comfort of a spring morning and the hope that in spite of all winter's ravages, man-made destruction to the environment, the earth is not going to die. An intense delight in nature. Green pastures in which we shall not want. A good poem is a poem which calls by its own reverberations. One word leads to another to be reverted in a new sense. The depth becomes the moment in which I discover with him is plenteous redemption. The experience of green pastures fills me with the certainty that I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The hurl and gliding of the bird become the hurl and gliding of sheer metaphysical, transcendental moment of my soul, the fire that breaks from thee then 1 billion times stowed lovelier, more dangerous. The unknown mother and the long hair at the back of the Greek warrior become turned into the moment when the darkness leaks down over his eyes, like in the lyrical moment, leaves the moment something snuffs them down. And lit, happy stillness of March morning becomes painful like the sight of tormented earth, while spring becomes a wishful for vision of green pastures after the depth of winter. Poetry offers endless connections to ponder. It is the richest and most stimulating conversation of the poet with the reader. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Marta. And thank you for sharing such a lot of very inspiring poems this afternoon. Absolutely perfect keynote after coffee. So thank you very much indeed. We're now going to open the floor to you for you to share your thoughts and reflections following Marta's talk. I think, as Cara's already told you, if you use the raise hand, and there are already some hands up in the bottom of your screen, or please put your name into chat. So without further ado, Gerald, I'll go straight to you.
So first of all, I'd like to thank the presenter for very inspiring work. And what caught my attention was actually the very first quotation, which is in her work, which says, poetry is the first and the last of all knowledge. The first and last of all knowledge. I just wanted to really know what really inspired a man to utter such a profound words about something like that. The words were so striking, and I just like the presenter to give us throw some light again on the meaning of those words. Poetry is the first and the last of all knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Gerald, thank you very much indeed. Before I ask Marta to reflect on that question, I wonder, does anybody else have anything that they would like to add, perhaps build on what Gerald said, or any other points or thoughts or reflections? Francesca.
Yes, I just wondered very quickly, a very quick reflection on, it seems to me, from what I've been hearing, that, and it's a pun in words, it seems that both the call of the poet and the call of the reader has something to do with hearing, being able to hear, to listen to something, to hear some mysterious.
Francesca, we've lost you. Okay.
So disconnection, probably.
Yeah, it says yes. I think she's.
It happens.
So Marta, I'm now going to go back to you, and perhaps you could just respond to Gerald before we move on.
Yes, I will. Thank you, Gerald, very much. And partly also a response to Francesca, although she's not formulated her question. Gerald, I've been thinking on this lecture for 2 years, because I was asked to give it 2 years ago, or even more. And then the conference was postponed. So I kept on reading I read a lot of poetry. I never read poetry in a sense that would be, how shall I put it, pedantical. I take a poet, sometimes this, sometimes that. I return to old poets with great pleasure, and I read new poetry with great pleasure, but it has to be a moment. And this was the first inspiration, that I thought the call of poetry is that I find the right poem in the right moment when I need it. That's one thing. The other thing, I thought, okay, that's me and the poet and the poem, but what about the poets? After all, they also have to have this call before they can start writing. They have to need to say something in a specific way. So I browsed through pages and pages of poets' enunciations about what they thought poetry was. And I thought that Wordsworth's words were, I like Wordsworth on the whole, I must say, and his belief in poetry and the power of his word. So I thought that I could quote his very strong statement about poetry as something that in fact is essential both for poets and for the readers. That's why I quoted him. Okay, and then I thought, but I also needed less romantic, less enthusiastic proposition. Not everybody is romantic at heart. And I thought that Frostian, more rational proposition, more 20th century, more up to date, shall we say, would be a sort of counterbalance to the idea how we may start thinking of poetry. And from these two, I started looking for more of what I could say. And the next thing was, of course, to try to find the right poems in which I could demonstrate how I answer the call, because if I am to talk about the answer to the call of poetry, I can only talk about my own experience. I can read essays of other people about poems and I can talk about their ideas, but to be convincing, I really have to start with my own response. Poetry is intimate, isn't it? It's about an intimate conversation. So if that answers your question, Gerald.
Thank you very much, Martha. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right, well, I don't know about Francesca because she hasn't finished quite.
No, I think we've temporarily lost Francesca.
We shall probably have time and opportunity to talk. Yes, thank
another
you.
time. Thank you so much, Martha. That was wonderful. And thank you for sharing almost behind the scenes in terms of your talk and how you came to what you presented. I think it's a lovely insight to have that you often don't get at conferences like this. So very much appreciated. Thank you. I'm now delighted to hand over to Cornelius Casey, who was the initial director of the Loyola Institute, who's going to introduce our final keynote speaker for today. So Cornelius, over to you. You just need to come off mute. There we go.
My words are wasted on mute. I am delighted and I'm very honored to be introducing Eileen Ní Chualathán and her poetry work in this conference. She is widely acclaimed as one of the leading Irish poets of her generation. As well as receiving several important honors, she was appointed to the prestigious position of the Ireland Professor of Poetry in 2016. So her work extends from the foundational collection Acts and Monuments in 1966, which won the Patrick Kavanagh Award, and through the Magdalene Sermon 1989, The Girl Who Married a Reindeer in 2001, to The Sunfish 2010, which won the International Griffith Poetry Award, and then a recent volume, The Boys of Blue Hill in 2015, which was shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best Collection. Just a brief curriculum vitae. Eileen Ní Chualathán was born in Cork City in 1942, and she was the daughter of Professor Cormac O'Chualathán and the novelist Eilish Dillon. She was educated at University College Cork and at Lady Margaret Hall, Oxford, before commencing her full-time academic career at Trinity College Dublin in 1966, where she lectured in medieval and Renaissance English for 45 years, up until her retirement as a professor of English in 2011. Her distinguished contribution to medieval and Renaissance studies occasioned the Festschrift, Enigma and Revelation in Renaissance English Literature, published to mark, as it says, the breadth and as well as the depth of Ní Chiallainán scholarship. Her work as a translator from Irish, Italian, and Romanian is a central part of her writing life. With Maeve McGuckian, she translated poems from the Irish by Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill in The Water Horse in 1999. And with Cormac O'Chillanáin and Gabriel Rosenstock, she was translated from the Italian of Michele Ranchiti in Verbale in 2002. And then poems by the Romanian poet Ilana Malanciu in the After the Raising of Lazarus, which appeared in 2005. So she's a distinguished poet, a distinguished academic, and a distinguished translator. There is a very impressive breadth of themes in her work, especially history, language, and translation, although I understand that she is going to read for us this evening from what she calls her convent poems. But it is important to realize that there is a very wide range of themes in her work as well. Perhaps just one other point to introduce Professor Ní Chiallainán. She is mostly an English language poet, though occasionally she writes in Irish, and she has expressed her desire to write a macaronic poem. That's a poem in two languages, and for her ideally in Irish and English. And it occurred to me that macaronic writing is a well-developed genre in the Irish canon, so to speak. There's a very well-known song or ballad, I suppose, to put in a few lines of it. It goes, Shul, shul, shularoon, is godetu ma vernin slán. I wish in vain, I wish I had my heart again. And in that poem, one language builds upon another. There's no translation from one to the other, but they're like two voices coming from a single poem. And that seems to me to be something, well, that's very dear to the heart of Eileen Ní Chiallainán, to write a macaronic poem. But it seems to me in a way she has been doing it, even though mostly in the English language, because the tradition of Irish writing and Irish poetry comes through in her work in a very profound way. It all reminded me about how far this tradition of Irish poetry writing goes, certainly back to the very brief 3 or 4 lines that you find in Irish in the medieval manuscripts, where the scribe would be working away translating or transcribing, I should say the Latin Gospels or commentaries, and would be suddenly inspired to write 3 lines of poetry in the margins in a completely different language, Irish. One of the best known is a 4-line poem that expresses a sense of dread that was permeating Irish monastic communities in the 19th century. It's translated by Cúnam Mair and many others. Bitter is the wind tonight. It tosses the ocean's white hair. Tonight I fear not the fierce warriors of Norway cruising on the Irish Sea. Let me end by saying that the tradition of the power of the word, alive and well in the 9th century and through all the centuries, speaks again for us in the work of the Ireland Professor of Poetry, Eileen Ní Chiallainán. And I look forward to hearing your work and reading this afternoon.
My name is Eileen Ní Chiallainán, and I'm going to read a few poems, which are all about, in different ways, about convents, which is a subject that I've been dealing with in odd ways all my life. When I started to write poetry, I was very young, and at that point of my life, I was very aware of convents. It was the 1950s. I was, of course, in a convent school. I had three nuns. I had three aunts who were nuns, and I had three other aunts who lived a much more pious life than the nuns. They all lived together and they prayed a lot, so that when the nuns came to visit, they actually would ring us up and say, we'd better come and stay with you. There's too much praying in this house. So I got an insight, I suppose, into the world of convents. And I became aware that an intelligent girl who seemed to be reasonably well behaved was a mark to be recruited into convents. And at a very young age, I became aware that this was not what I wanted to do. So in the sense of what we used to call a vocation to the religious life, I was very sure that I hadn't got one. And I was becoming gradually aware that I had something of a vocation to be a poet. We've been talking about words in this conference, how words and language draw us in, as it were. And I felt that I was being drawn in to a vocation as a poet because of words and language, partly because of the fact that I grew up in a household where two languages were spoken, Irish and English. So it was fairly inevitable that I would take to the writing of poetry. What was not inevitable to me, I didn't realize, was that as soon as I started to write seriously, with the idea of being published, the subjects of my poetry suddenly started to contain these religious figures, individual nuns or convent spaces. And it seemed that the whole metaphorical structure of the religious life had ingrained itself very deeply in my mind. So I'm going to start with a poem called Swineherd. This is a very early poem. It's about 50 years old now. And I wrote it when I was in my first academic job, which was also my last academic job. I only ever had one. Lasted for 55 years. But I suppose you never work as hard as you do in your early years as an academic. And at a certain moment, I began to feel if only one could get away from all this. And what I was thinking of was getting away into a convent. Swineherd. When all this is over, said the swineherd, I mean to retire where nobody will have heard about my special skills, and conversation is mainly about the weather. I intend to learn how to make coffee, at least as well as the Portuguese lay sister in the kitchen, and polish the brass fenders every day. I want to lie awake at night, listening to cream crawling to the top of the jug and the water lying soft in the cistern. I want to see an orchard where the trees grow in straight lines and the yellow fox finds shelter between the navy blue trunks, where it gets dark early in summer and the apple blossom is allowed to wither on the bough. As I said, I wrote that poem 50 years ago, and the convent that I was imagining in it was in Belgium. One of my aunts was the Mother Superior of that convent. She had various other similar jobs during her life as a nun. She was the Mother Superior, I think, because she couldn't cook. The Portuguese nuns were beautiful cooks, and so they ended up in the kitchen. But her life as a manager, as a director, as somebody who had to argue with her chaplain and the local mairie, very much impressed me as an image of an independent woman. And my experience of nuns was partly becoming aware of the possibilities for independence, which were not really available to many women in Ireland at that time. My great friend Margaret McCurtain, the historian, emphasized this fact that when Irish women were tied up in the home, Irish nuns were going on missions, founding hospitals, running schools, doing all the things that they had talents for. My Aunt Anna, the one who was the superior of the convent in Belgium, lived to be almost 80. She was 78 when I wrote about the events that I'm going to mention in my next poem. I'm interested in that because it's the same age as I am now. She had joined the convent after having a job in a shop. It was all she was going to get because all the education in the family went to my father because he was the boy. But she joined an order in France and of course had to learn French very quickly at the same time as she was learning the rule of the convent, which was at that stage, it was in the late 1930s, you never referred to anything as mine. So you spoke about our shoe, our stocking. She went to the dentist and said, I have a pain in our teeth. And he thought she was mad. The poem is called J'ai mal à nos dents, in memory of Anna Cullinan, Sister Mary Anthony. The Holy Father gave her leave to return to her father's house at 78 years of age. When young, in the Franciscan house at Calais, she complained to the dentist, I have a pain in our teeth, her body dissolving out of her first mother, her 5 sisters aching at home. Her brother listened to news 5 times in a morning on Radio Éireann in Cork as the Germans entered Calais. Her name lay under the surface. He could not see her working all day with the sisters, stripping the hospital, loading the sick on lorries, while Reverend Mother walked the wards and nourished them with jugs of wine to hold their strength. J'étais à moitié saoul. It was done. They lifted the old sisters onto the pig cart, and the young walked out on the road to Dèvres, the wine still buzzing and the plains over their heads. Je mangerai les pissenlits par les racines. A year before she died, she lost her French accent, going home in her habit to care for her sister Nora, une malade, à soigner une malade. They handed her back her body, its voices, and its death. I'll translate the other 3 French phrases. J'étais à moitié saoul means I was half pissed. Je mangerai les pissenlits par les racines means I'll be pushing up daisies, I'll be dead. It means I'll be eating dandelions by the roots. And the last one, une malade, à soigner une malade, one sick person looking after another. She used to speak French to me after she returned to Ireland. It was, she wanted to keep up the language. My last collection of poems was called The Mother House. I suppose that well into my 70s, I thought I should really confront this whole subject of nuns and convents and, as it were, get it all said. One reason for this was I saw in the newspaper a statement that a particular convent in Cork was going to be redeveloped as a cultural centre. It was the convent that was originally founded in the 18th century by a woman called Nan O'Nagel, who started the illegal project of running a school for Catholic girls. She's presently had to take on boys as well, and she started an enormous movement. She did not want to become a nun, but she founded what became what's now called the Presentation Order. And she didn't want to be a nun because she didn't want to be enclosed. And so the first poem that I'm going to read is called An Imperfect Enclosure. But when I heard that the convent was about to be redeveloped, I thought I must see it before that happens. And I went to Cork and saw it and revived my sense. So Cork is my native city. I revived my sense of her presence in that place. An imperfect enclosure. She was out in all weathers. She was tired. Someone gave her a chair in a shop, rested, and then away in the street on the move. The house she built first, giving on the street. Could she close up doors and windows on that side? It would be noticed as a convent. She asked to be buried in the common cemetery. They broke through the wall of the nuns' graveyard and slipped her coffins inside. But she would not stay, so they built her a stone tomb nearer to Cove Lane and opened a hatch at one end so hands can touch the coffin. I mentioned the town of Dèvres, which was where the mother house of the Franciscans of Calais was. And when my aunts joined that order, there were two of them. They had, of course, they left Cork and went to France. And this poem is a reimagining of that international side of their lives. How they never lost, any more than I have myself, their connection with their home, the place where their family still stayed, but also how they had got, from the moment of their entering the convent, they had acquired this international dimension, and of course this other language, which was French. They traveled first on the liner, the ship that left from Cork Harbour and went to Le Havre. And from there, they went on to the novitiate, which was then in Calais. And the poem is called To the Mother House. The tender heaved on its way across. The liner floated grand in the harbour, and the girls, afraid of looking back, picked out a porthole and stared and waited for this parting to be over. There was a war coming. There was work. The novices would never see a soldier, only smile at meager faces in the Alpine sanatorium. They nursed the miners hammered in the pit, learning their obstinate love, meeting the mistress who came after death with a cushion to go in the coffin embroidered with bébé. The older nun lived through Ravensbrück, sent there after hiding a crashed airman in the laundry. Sister Clara, Sister Anthony, meeting a niece in the quiet convent garden in Dèvres, are overheard reminiscing, always in French, about their first convent on the hill in Cork and its precious holdings, the penal chalice, the letters from an Italian priest, it's hoped soon to be beatified, the foundress's diaries, and all that was sent from the mother house, wine and brandy, lace, the little medals blessed and certified in Rome in the Holy Year, a relic of the True Cross in its gold box, a fine linen alb embroidered in Portugal by a novice, marble for the shrine. The marble is there still under the altar. The mule driver's curses, the rattling ass and cart leave no sign on the stone. It sucks in meaning. Marble is perfect, how it shows the bones inside the skin, the folds in the light shroud and the trailing strands of hair. The end of that poem is a gesture again to that part of Cork where Nan O'Nagel founded her convent. It has a church which had to be on a back street because it was illegal to have a Catholic church in a centre. And in that church, there is a very beautiful marble dead Christ by the Cork sculptor, John Hogan. So there was some luxury at the centre of Catholic life, even in the times of persecution. But here, there's also the fact that not all the records of that period were properly kept. My friend Margaret McCurtain, one of her great crusades was to get convents to find their archives, make them available. She wasn't always successful. This poem is called Carr's Lane, and it's about a decayed convent. There isn't a sign of a nun in it, but it's about what can happen when a place that has been important is abandoned. Carr's Lane. You can see the tall front door, but don't expect to be admitted. On your left is Carr's Lane. At the corner, a newspaper shop. Up the lane, a doorway, steps worn pale by rain and people climbing, unlocked at the agreed time, on quiet days for callers they know. Scholars disagree about Carr's Lane. Is it Cart's Lane corrupted? Or was there a prosperous local merchant family called Carr? They could have grown rich selling butter to the transatlantic trade or beef abroad. If their books gave their story, those have all been cleared. The dealer came one Monday early. The shelves were bare before noon. The library is closed off. Dangerous. Woodworm in the floorboards. There's something of an allusion in that poem to the fact that the city of Cork, there were many prosperous Catholic merchants. They made their money, some of them, selling provisions to the slave trade. The slave trade was not based in Ireland. There were no trading ports in this country, but they did sell butter and beef to the French traders on their way to the West Indies. And that's history. History of a different kind is in the last poem that I'm going to read. This is a story that was told me by Margaret McCurtain, who died this year at the age of 90. And as I said, was a crusader for convents keeping proper records and looking after them properly. But she told me this story, which really seems to me rather like a folk tale. And it's about the idea of a vocation, which can sometimes, it seems, come in some very odd ways. It was told to me by her as a true story, and I don't see why it shouldn't have been true. It's called She Was at the Haymaking. She was down in the small field, turning the last swathes of hay on the slope facing the river mouth. Each time she came back up, she saw the wave so gently courting the land with shallow pushes and the curved edge of the tide making its way upstream. She was alone in the field. They were up in the house with Mary, whose bag was packed, waiting for the car to bring her on the first stage, the start of her long voyage, away to the far shores of America and the novitiate. She worked on with the rake, thinking of the rolling wave, an eye watching for the car. When she heard it on the road, she brought the rake up with her on the steep path to the house. They were all there in the parlour, Mary sitting in the middle, her face amazed. I can't go. Now that it's time, I can't go. Her parents said nothing. Her sister had come to bid her goodbye. Now she said, "So I'll go." She shook a small bit of hay out of her hair. She washed her hands. She took up the bag and went off with the driver to a house full of rules, so far away that when she wrote to say she was happy, the letter took 3 weeks crossing the sea. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to open the floor again. Marta, thank you very much for your thoughts and reflections. Any further thoughts and reflections on the call of poetry and what you've heard today? Yes, Robert, thank you for waving at me. Over to you.
That's all right. You're very waveable at, if I may say so. You're allowed to wave back.
I'll wave back to you. There you go.
We've been thinking very much in terms of the individual poet and the individual reader, but poetry also has a collective function. And in a religious context, poetry is often performed. Actually, in Turkey, it has a liturgical function. I was actually listening to the first keynote address. I was thinking about the function of Newman as a hymnodist. And I first came across Newman's work by singing hymns that were settings of his words. Lead Kindly Light, for example, is constantly sung as a hymn in Anglican churches, and I'm sure in Catholic churches as well, probably in a number of churches. I don't know enough about Newman to know whether he had any conception at all that his poem would be used as a hymn, because hymn singing actually is a Methodist tradition that was adopted by the Anglican Church and probably later on by the Catholic Church. So hymnody and hymn singing established itself across the Christian Church. Does anybody know enough about Newman to know whether he had any conception that his poetry might be used in that way?
So, Robert, thank you very much for that question. I'm just going to take another thought or reflection. Then I might ask, without putting David on the spot, David Jasper to respond to that, if you're happy to do so. Hilary, do you have a comment you'd like to make, or is it a...
It was really in relation partly to Marta's very, very interesting paper, in which she gave us many fascinating attempts to define what poetry is, which of course is famously difficult to do. And in the ones she chose, I'm sure that she had plenty others she could have used, there wasn't really any explicit mention, though I know all the poets would have been thinking about it, about language and sound. There's a lot about thought and emotion, form and sound. And that's an incredibly important part of what a poet is trying to do. And I'd also like to make the point as a poet that when you are writing poetry, it is a completely synthetic activity. You are not thinking thought, image, sound. It is an indescribable synthesis of language, thought, image. And that's one reason why, of course, it's very difficult to define what poetry is. But I'd like to offer Paul Valéry's one, which I do really like, which I'll give you a translation to everybody in English. There's a long hesitation between sound and sense, and you're always hovering between sound and sense, and never quite knowing why you choose one rather than another. So I put that out for people to think about.
Hilary, thank you very much. A perfect thought to throw out at the end of a day when we've been looking at the call of poetry. David Jasper, are you happy that I come back to you now to respond to Robert's question around Cardinal Newman and hymn writing?
Well, I'm certainly happy to have a go. I don't claim any particular knowledge of the exact question. I mean, what just occurs to me is that, first of all, in a way, Newman, of course, didn't set out to write hymns. Lead Kindly Light is one of the great 19th century hymns, in fact, but it didn't begin life as a hymn. And the other two hymns that are certainly commonly sung in the Anglican Church are taken from the Dream of Gerontius. Firmly I believe and truly, and Praise of the Holiest in the Height. The second of these, Praise of the Holiest in the Height, of course, in a certain sense, is a hymn, because anybody who knows, the great Elgar setting of that realizes that it's in a sense sung, it's the great shout of praise, in heaven, as Gerontius' soul is accepted into heaven. And so I'm less persuaded that Firmly I Believe and Truly is a particularly good hymn, because hymns, it seems to me, are a very particular kind of poetry that are being asked to do a very particular thing. First of all, they're sung in a community. And second, it seems to me that they have to really kind of work at the same speed as they're being sung. So unlike, Gerard Manley Hopkins, for example, who could never, I suspect, write a particularly good hymn because his poetry demands such profound reflection, whereas a hymn, it has to be carried at the same time as you actually take to sing it. But Praise to the Holiest in the Height, which in the usual Anglican version has the first and the last verses is the same, seems to me to be precisely everything that a poem and a hymn in that context should be. And so taking it into our hymns in church, it doesn't say anything except a great shout of praise, but what more can you ask poetry to do than that, really? But apart from those three, I'm not aware of any other poems of Newman that are sung as hymns, and he certainly doesn't seem to have set out to write hymns, as clearly a lot of Victorian hymn writers very successfully did. So that's just my kind of off-the-cuff reflection, and thank you for bringing that up.
David, thank you very much indeed, and Robert, thank you for the reflection question. Any other thoughts or questions? Gerald, over to you, and then Madeline, I'll come to you. Gerald, over to you.
I just want to make a contribution, adding on to what others have already shared about him, John Henry Newman's hymns, which someone said were so hypnotic and very powerful. I am talking in particular about his hymn on the Lead Kindly Light, because the question actually was that whether he actually knew they will have such influence later. And the knowledge I have about how he wrote the Lead Kindly Light was when he was still an Anglican, but he went to Rome, he went to Italy, and was coming back from Italy. And an experience, he had a very bad experience. We're told he was not even feeling fine. And so on the way back from Rome to Italy, I think it was at Sicily, he decided to write this hymn. I'm sure the experience there was the pain, or maybe the pain of the illness that he had, that he was feeling, maybe feeling he's going back home, the light leading him back again to England. I think and with that, I think he never knew that particular hymn will have such influence later, a hymn which is sung now, which is so popular today. Yeah, that's just a little I had to contribute about that particular hymn.
Gerald, thank you very much indeed. Madeline, over to you.
Yeah, just kind of following up on the idea of Lead Kindly Light, because as far as I'm aware, in 1870, Bishop Bickersteth added a stanza to Newman's hymn, because to Newman's poem, because he thought that it wasn't suitable as it was to be sung as a hymn. And he wanted something that was more assured in its faith to be sung. And he wrote a letter to Newman explaining this, and also mentioning that the poem and the hymn had brought a lot of comfort to his ailing daughter. And then Newman replied to the bishop in a letter saying something along the lines that, yeah, the poem wasn't initially meant to be a hymn. It wasn't, the verses were not a hymn. And that he was at once surprised and gratified by the fact that it has been used as a hymn and included in a collection. So yeah, I just wanted to add that bit of...
Madeline, thank you very much indeed for adding that. And thank you all for your thoughts and reflections. I'm just going to wonder whether Eileen has managed to join us. Eileen, are you with us? Eileen, are you with us?
Ask her to unmute.
Yes, I think, Eileen, could you unmute if you're with us?
I'm pressing the...
No, we can, Patrick, we can unmute and mute people centrally. So, which I probably shouldn't tell you, actually. We have a secret power that we can unmute and mute people.
No, we can only mute people. We can't unmute.
Yeah,
we can ask them to unmute.
Eileen, are you with us? Can you hear us?
No, it's a connection issue.
Okay, I think in that case, David Lonsdale, I'm going to come to you because I think you're... Oh, Eileen, you are with us. How lovely to see you again. Eileen, could you unmute, please? Great.
Yes.
So Eileen, would you like to, it would be fabulous if you could read a poem for us.
All right, I will read one poem in the hope that I can be, that it will.
And I tell you what, we will have the pleasure of listening to that poem. We can share the poems on the website afterwards, but I think it's probably best if you just read it to us. That would be fabulous. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This is a poem called An Imperfect Enclosure, and it's about the woman from the city of Cork who founded the Presentation Order of Nuns, but did not wish to become a nun herself because she would have been enclosed. And after she died, well, the poem tells what else happened. She was out in all weathers. She was tired. Someone gave her a chair in a shop, rested, and then away in the street on the move. The house she built first, giving on the street. Could she close up doors and windows on that side? It would be noticed as a convent. She asked to be buried in the common cemetery. They broke through the wall of the nun's graveyard and slipped her coffin inside. But she would not stay, so they built her a stone tomb nearer to Cove Lane and opened a latch at one end so hands could touch the coffin. Thank you very much, and I'm really sorry for the disaster.
No, it hasn't been a disaster. It's one of those things, but we appreciate you sticking with it. So thank you very much indeed. I'm just wondering, is there time for one more poem? Could you read one more? Because I think we'd all really enjoy that.
I'll read one more poem, which is a true story, told, at least told to me as true, by Sister Margaret McCurtain, a Dominican nun who died, and a great historian who died this year at the age of 90. And it's a story about a vocation. It's called She Was at the Haymaking. She was down in the small field, turning the last swathes of hay on the slope facing the river mouth. Each time she came back up, She saw the wave so gently courting the land with shallow pushes, and the curved edge of the tide making its way upstream. She was alone in the field. They were up in the house with Mary, whose bag was packed, waiting for the car to bring her on the first stage, the start of her long voyage away to the far shores of America and the novitiate. She worked on with the rake, thinking of the rolling wave, an eye watching for the car. When she heard it on the road, she brought the rake up with her on the steep path to the house. They were all there in the parlor, Mary sitting in the middle, her face amazed. I can't go. Now that it's time, I can't go. Her parents said nothing. Her sister had come to bid her goodbye. Now she said, so I'll go. She shook a small bit of hay out of her hair. She washed her hands. She took up the bag and went off with the driver to a house full of rules, so far away that when she wrote to say she was happy, the letter took 3 weeks crossing the sea.
Eileen, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks.
David, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Yeah. Just before I do that, Liz, I wonder whether there's any way in which we could somehow ask Eileen to record her talk again and record it, and then put it on the conference website with the others.
Yes, we'll sort that out this evening, David.
Great, thank you. Hello, my name is David Lonsdale. I'm a retired senior lecturer and Dean of Postgraduate Studies at the now defunct Heathrop College in London University. I'm currently Research Associate at the Margaret Beaufort Institute of Theology in Cambridge. 2021 is the 10th birthday of the Power of the Word, and I've been closely involved in the project from the beginning. Here in the UK, many of us have been focused recently on the G7 conference in Cornwall and the proposals, promises and resolutions that would or would not be agreed by the end of it. Here on the first day of this conference, I'm reminding myself that the aims of the Power of the Word conferences are not so much to reach some kind of consensus or set of resolutions. The important thing is the conversation itself between writers, students, scholars in literature, philosophy, theology, and spirituality. And in this, it seems to me, we've made a very good start today in focusing and conducting that conversation. So just a few moments from the day, really. At the beginning, Professor David Jasper gave us a philosophical and theological framework for engaging in a conversation about the call of literature by way of John Henry Newman's idea of the illative sense. Newman was referring to that power of the human mind to accept beliefs and make judgments about matters of faith by way of the imagination and a balance of probabilities, rather than by inference and logical reasoning. It's this power, this illative sense, that makes the mind capable of responding both to a call to religious faith and to the call of imaginative literature. The call of literature. Perhaps we might usefully imagine this call by way of a metaphor, as a precious stone with a number of different facets, and the purpose of our conversations in this conference being to explore each of these facets in itself and in relation to each other and to the stone as a whole. Today, for example, we've begun to explore the question of what poetry is called to be. Does poetry have a vocation, as it were, to be or do something beyond its own delightful self? Is poetry called to be a teacher, for example, or to play the role of prophet, or to lead us into a deeper understanding of faith and transcendent mystery? What is literature called to be and to do? I'm reminded of comments made by Seamus Heaney in his lecture on the redress of poetry. He doesn't deny poetry's possible social, redressing, or didactic functions, but cautions that in focusing on these, we run the risk of losing sight of its primary purpose, which is to give delight. In a memorable phrase, delight first, then wisdom. A second facet of this stone might be described as the call to write, the call to be a writer. What does that mean? We might ask, to hear a call to be a poet, a playwright, a novelist. In what sense is it analogous to, or potentially in conflict with, a religious vocation? In the breakout sessions, we've begun to explore this aspect of call in the case of a number of poets, including William Blake, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Percy Shelley, Gerard Manley Hopkins, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, and Milan Rufus. Towards the end of the day, in the plenary sessions, our attention turned to poets' own responses to the call. Professor Marta Gibinska noted that poets' responses to the call of literature are as numerous and varied as the poets themselves. And she illustrated this with a wealth of examples from a range of cultures, literatures, historical periods, and individual poets. And in the final plenary session, we were given insight into what the call might mean to one particular poet. A third theme, but one which has not received much attention so far, after all, it is only the first day, is the call of literature in the sense of the call to read, to be a reader. I imagine that everyone attending this conference at some time or other, consciously or unconsciously, has felt the call to be a reader of literature. My mother taught me to read before I started school, and I've been reading ever since. Responding seriously and positively to the call to be a reader, if you think about it, is no trivial matter. It opens us up not only to reading, but to being read, for better and changed, for better or for worse, by the books and the texts that we read. What we read and how we read have far-reaching consequences in terms of the influences which mold us, the decisions by which we give shape and direction to our lives, and hence the people we become and the worlds we build. Finally, I'd like to mention a fourth theme, which has been a little bit lurking below the surface of today's discussions: the moral, spiritual, and religious ambivalence in the call of literature. By that, I mean the tensions, ambiguities, and paradoxes inherent in the coexistence of light and darkness, comedy and tragedy, love and hatred, charity and violence in literature. The world of literature has the power to be both life-enhancing and destructive. This, in turn, points to the need for moral and spiritual discernment on the part of both writers and readers. Miłosz thought that, quotation, poems should be written only with the hope that good spirits, not evil ones, choose us for their instrument. This presence of ambivalence tension, and paradox in literature is likely to be explored further tomorrow, when we consider the work of, for example, Flannery O'Connor, Michel Houellebecq, and Enda Walsh. Lots to look forward to. In the meantime, I wish you a peaceful sleep and sweet dreams. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, David. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thank you all very much indeed. Good night.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Jean.